I'm Ryan Polk. I'm the Director of Internet Policy at the Internet Society, where I'm also the co-lead on our encryption project and a member of the steering committee of the Global Encryption Coalition. So encryption is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Joining me on today are Riana Pfefferkorn, who's a research scholar at Stanford Internet Observatory, and her research focuses on encryption policy in the US and abroad. She also researches online trust and safety, as well as novel forms of electronic surveillance by law enforcement. Also, she's got a fantastic Twitter, and if there's anything in the world that's happening on encryption that you need to know what's actually going on, follow her on Twitter. Next, we have Mallory Knodel, who's the CTO at the Center for Democracy and Technology in Washington, D.C. As a public interest technologist, she's a member of the Internet Architecture Board, the co-chair of the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Research Group of the Internet Research Task Force, and she holds a Bachelor's of Science in Physics and Mathematics and a Master's degree in Science Education. CDT is also a member of the steering committee of the Global Encryption Coalition, and a really good partner on trying to promote and defend encryption around the world. So now that we've gotten our introductions out of the way, let's get to what we're actually going to be talking about today, which is this concept of content moderation and encryption and how they're intertwined. If you look at the global encryption debate that's raged for, I guess now nearly 30 years, oftentimes it's been really tied into this concept of how does law enforcement gain access to end-to-end encrypted data? And so the idea of encryption backdoors, of man-in-the-middle attacks, and other things like that have really been at the forefront of that debate. But in the last few years, we've seen really a shift. And this shift has been towards the idea of content moderation, and how do platforms look at and monitor user content for illegal or objectionable content. Now, this concept is very much tied to the issue of end-to-end encryption and the issue of how do we protect end-to-end encryption. And we've seen this issue come to the forefront of the debate in a lot of places around the world recently with potential legislation. So here in the United States, the EARN Act is looking at how do we get platforms to monitor content in the US for really bad illegal content. And that's currently in Congress, where they're debating that law. At the same time, in the United Kingdom, there's the Online Safety Bill, which looks at doing nearly the exact same thing. In recent years, in Brazil, there was a misinformation bill that's still kind of kicking around there, looking at the topic of misinformation and what should platforms be doing to tackle misinformation. And then lastly, last year, the Indian government passed traceability requirements for platforms that looked at, for objectionable or illegal content, the ability for platforms to trace back who originally sent that content. With all of these rules, they try to tackle the issue of content monitoring, and would bring content monitoring into force for a lot of different for platforms. But there's a lot of considerations there around encryption and end-to-end encryption. In particular, can you actually do content moderation without breaking end-to-end encryption? Because a lot of technologists say that you can't. And that's where this debate really is. So today we'll have Mallory Knodel talking about content moderation and different means of doing that in a presentation, followed by Riana, who's going to talk about different trust and safety techniques and some research that she's done around how industry is actually looking at these topics and different ways of trying to do content moderation. Mallory, take it away.
Thanks, Ryan. Also like to say that you're also a very good partner with ISOC on the Global Encryption Coalition, so thanks for that. So yeah, I'm Mallory Knodel. Thanks for the introduction already. I'm mostly talking about a paper that's out now, and I can drop a link in the chat soon. unless somebody else beats me to it. But this came out in August last year, which was a really good time to come out, given there was a lot of news around encryption around that time of year. And so I've had the privilege of talking about this paper that CDT did with Brown University since then. So I'm going to go through, I think, faster than I usually present it, but it's because I want to get to the good questions we have queued up and those that have come from all of you. So this was a collaboration within Center for Democracy and Technology, and also with Cindy Kamara from Brown University and Lucy Quinn. So just wanted to give a heads up or a nod to all of those folks that worked on this. The reason why I think it's been useful to reframe the discussion to one of content moderation is because there's actually quite a lot that can be done on platforms in general with respect to content moderation that does not necessarily speak to the specific encryption piece or the encryption backdoor. And by approaching it from a content moderation perspective, we were able to also learn a lot and get a lot deeper into what are the issues with content moderation more broadly, and what are those that are specific then to end-to-end encrypted platforms. So I think it's in a way been able to neutralize the very polarizing debate over backdoors. And also just bring in a lot more user-focused solutions as well, because another reason why content moderation is so important is to improve user experience. So that's something that I learned quite a lot about as we worked on this research project. So in that way, I'm going to do a little bit of an overview of content moderation, and then I'll talk a little bit about encryption, and then we'll talk about some of the proposed solutions to doing content moderation in end-to-end encrypted systems that this paper evaluates. And then we'll get to the actual analysis of which of those we felt were viable and that did not sort of undermine or, that didn't break encryption, basically. It didn't undermine users' expectations for confidentiality and privacy. So in content moderation, and this is more general, right? There are essentially 6 phases, not necessarily in any linear order, but in order for platforms to do content moderation, they need to define what it is they will moderate, either through terms of service or because of legal obligations. Then you have to detect it somehow on the platform. So how does that detection work? That's actually the thrust of this paper. So out of all the 6 phases, the one we focus most on is detection, because that is ultimately kind of where this all then begins. If you are looking in end-to-end encrypted systems, that detection is obviously harder. Then there's an evaluation phase after it's detected to determine whether or not indeed it is a violation of the definition for what kinds of content or behavior wouldn't be allowed. The other is information. Sorry, I think these are wrong. Anyway, the next phase should actually be action. So what happens then to the content once it's been evaluated to, yes, it's violating the terms, and then what you do as a result. So how then do you moderate that? Do you delete the post? Do you ban the user? I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that can happen as a result of content or behavior that violates the definition that then needs to be taken care of. There's got to be somewhere in this loop an appeal, right? You need to allow users on the platform to flag things that, or to appeal that action, so that, you know, if it was satire, if it was wrong or misunderstood or something, there's that recourse and remedy. And then education is kind of something that's pervasive. So if you have these rules and you have these actions you're taking on platforms, users need to understand how to avoid it. Obviously, there's a fine line there between like educating users about what's allowed and what's not, and giving users acting in bad faith the information they need to elide or go around those guardrails. So, you know, that's an important one. But we're not going to dwell so much on each of these. We're actually going to drill down into looking at detection specifically. So there are many different axes. I like to think of it as sort of a matrix along which the detection phase is done. So one would be, proactive, which is, the platform itself is going after and looking at all the content that's being posted and all the behavior that's happening and trying to look for things that are in violation. The other is reactive. So, users are posting things and then reporting them, or somebody posts in the news, so there's two sides to that. Another axis is what content versus metadata. So you're also, and this is what I like to think of as the difference between content and behavior. So metadata being the behavior, right? Like how often you're posting, what the timestamp is on those. There's just a lot, I think, there in the metadata that constitutes essentially user behavior. Yeah. And then of course we have the content, what's actually in the image, what's actually in the text, etc. And then also there's another axis where the platforms can look at things, sort of before they're posted. Meaning like you're composing it, you're uploading the video, you're ready to put on the platform, or if you're looking for things that are already out and published and that sort of thing. So that's the different axes. There could be more as well, but then it's harder to draw more than 3 dimensions. So these are then, I'm not going to go through too much encryption piece because I feel like that is maybe some fundamental understanding that we all have at this point about what constitutes encryption, but I'll just very briefly say that in the paper, we do treat a section on an attempt at a definition, and we also look at the different contexts for encryption. So of course there's transport encryption, which because that's between, it's not really end to end. So transport encryption is not what we would consider to be encryption between two people. It's people and a service. And there can be then intervention by the service, the platform provider on transport encryption. So that would be out of scope. But things like end-to-end messaging, so messaging apps primarily, and we also look at then storage. So this would be encryption at rest, considering that to be end-to-end. If you are both endpoints, you're the only one with the keys, and how would that work? So, and I think then, if I recall correctly, we sort of move on from there with that grounding in like what we're considering and what some of the proposals that have come out then also consider to be end-to-end encryption. And so these are the proposals before you right now. You have, we did 5, there's certainly more. Ryan and I worked on a paper that took down, I think, 13 different proposals, was it? Including some plain text, straight up backdoors that was leaked from the European Council a while back. And so this doesn't include all of those different proposals that have been out there, but I think these 5 are sort of the most common and kind of are in some cases like umbrella approaches to content moderation and encrypted systems that might have additional derivatives. But we'll get to those and it'll become apparent. So the first we looked at was user reporting. There's also then, how to use user reports as a way of doing content moderation. What are the trade-offs and how would that work? Then we looked at metadata analysis. So to be very clear, we would not propose this would be metadata in general for analysis, but just the existing sort of metadata analysis that platforms are already doing for the purposes of, say, spam or other things. Traceability, this is a proposal, as was mentioned in the introduction, that is, in a real policy decision in India and proposed in Brazil and elsewhere to actually be able to see what the provenance of different messages. Perceptual hashing is the 4th one that we looked at. This is where you have known content that is a violation and that you fine tune some tolerance for what images, how like those images they are. So meaning like, it wouldn't be necessarily an exact match, but some ability to see or use computer vision to detect that content as it moves across the platform. And then the last one takes it a step further. It's very similar to perceptual hashing, but it's trying to determine what kinds, like trying to determine how to see additional computer vision on, what's not allowed. Is that nudity, for example? So let's go through each one with the remaining time I have left. So, I'll just tell you, spoiler alert, that the first two options, user reporting and metadata analysis, were really the only two options that we felt would continue to fulfill the promises of end-to-end encryption and allow some degree of content moderation, and the rest would violate the sort of confidentiality and privacy promises of end-to-end encryption. So I'll dwell a little bit more on these first two for that reason. So user reporting sounds really simple. You would empower users with features like block and report, those kinds of things, which are good for users in general, right? We kind of like the ability to get garbage out of our feed and that sort of thing. But how do you do that in a way that's privacy preserving? That is the main focus of this section of our analysis, in taking the detection phase, which the user is giving you by reporting it to you. But then, as we said before, it needs to be evaluated. How do you know the user isn't just, trying to get something off that isn't actually a violation of terms of service? And then you have to action it. So along those steps, it becomes very important to do one's best to make that reporting private. Say, for example, the reporting isn't done in good faith. You don't want to alert the platform then to user privacy. That would be a violation. You would be sort of giving up information about that person. So this is where then hashing comes in, where you can do your best to keep that secret, and to only decrypt the necessary information to make the determination, but not violate the privacy of the sender. There's more detail in the paper. Metadata analysis. Again, I just can't say enough that we are not in favor of creating more metadata about messages for the sake of content moderation, but there is a sort of minimal amount of metadata that is required to get a message from point A to point B. There is a requirement that the protocol and that the service will need. And based on that, there's quite a lot that maybe is surprising to folks can be done, especially in terms of like coordinated inauthentic behavior, spam, that sort of thing. Violation of platform abuse, I would say, is something that metadata can help with. So it's not going to, for example, metadata analysis is not going to help probably like law enforcement investigation, but metadata analysis is a valid way of doing some degree of content moderation on your platform to get some low-hanging fruit that really just ought not to be on there. And platforms already do this because of these reasons, because it gets garbage off their service. It makes sure that the security of their service is intact, that sort of thing. So it doesn't read into content, and it shouldn't be violating privacy beyond what it's already being used to do. Traceability. Okay, so I think of traceability as basically enhanced metadata. The whole premise is that you kind of already have the content, right? Like somebody's been given an objectionable piece of content and said, I want you to tell me where this came from. So already you're working with the assumption that you know what the content is. But even if you're not, even if somehow in some scenario, which someone would have to explain to me, you don't know what's inside a piece of content, but you just want to know where it came from. I want to know where this big block of ciphertext came from. Fine. But the problem with that request is that you would have to fundamentally change the platforms in a way that would create a ton of extra data that is unnecessary about every single message on the platform. So it's sort of very expensive. It'd be like layers of crypto. And again, at the end of the day, the reason why somebody wants to know where it came from is because they know what's inside. Perceptual hashing. So aside from the fact that it may be a little bit dubious as a way of doing content moderation, a lot of mistakes, a lot of errors, collisions with hashing and that sort of thing. The problem is, of course, what happens in the additional stages of content moderation, that you need to do an evaluation phase, you need to have an appeal phase. All those things matter quite a lot, and that puts a human in the loop to view this content, and that is then a third party looking at messages that should have been only between sender and receiver. So it's considered a violation and not something that we would endorse doing. This is the use case that was, of course, very popular back in August, was the database of known child sexual abuse material that's maintained by NCMEC. And there's a similar proposal that the EU and the EC would have something similar, and they would sort of actually by law force through an API the use of content moderation against that known hash database. I'm out of time. I would just finish by saying the last piece of analysis, and maybe we'll get to some of the future work in the questions and answers, which is predictive modeling. So this is just very, very tricky to do. Even if we have like incredibly advanced forms and methods of this in the future, I'm not saying that it's not possible. I'm just saying that I think it has the same problems as I mentioned with perceptual hashing. It's now looking for new and novel content that isn't known, but might be, child sexual abuse material, explicit imagery, that sort of thing. So not, I think at this stage, definitely something that should be a serious proposal. And I would even say, even if it were perfect, you're kind of back to the same issues with the perceptual hashing. So anyway, that's it. Like I said, hoping to get to more in future work in the questions and answers, because I think this project in particular has led us down a lot of really interesting pathways for how to fill in existing research gaps now. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Mallory, and thank you for distilling a whole bunch of really, really technical issues down into 15 minutes so well. That was very impressive. And I highly recommend that people read CDT's paper from August of last year on this issue, because it does a really good job of explaining it even further. So next up, we have Riana, who's going to talk about a lot of these same techniques and her research into how industry views these.
So I'm going to present the results of survey research that I did starting about a year ago now about the trust and safety practices of various online service providers. I just published the results of this, a paper that describes a lot more than what I'm going to present to you today, which are just the highlights, in volume 2 of the Journal of Online Trust and Safety, which is a brand new peer-reviewed multidisciplinary journal founded by my colleagues and I here at Stanford. And I will put up a link to the paper at the end. So as some background, my motivation for doing this survey was that we've been having these discussions like the one we're doing today about how can you do content moderation in an increasingly end-to-end encrypted world. And I noticed that a lot of the discussions tended to take as a given that the only way of doing trust and safety is that you have to have access to content. You have to be able to do content analysis. We know that's not true. There's plenty of methods that are out there already, some of which Mallory already touched upon, that do not require at-will access to content on the part of the provider. And so my goal was just to surface more information about those sorts of techniques where they're already in use and find out more about their prevalence and about how useful they are to providers. And so the terminology that I came up with for this paper distinguishes between those two categories. Where I talk about content-dependent trust and safety techniques, as the name suggests, that means techniques that only work if the provider has at-will access to the contents of users' files and communications. And some examples that I class under content-dependent are automated scanning of the contents of files, for example, looking for bad links to known viruses and malware in Gmail, for example, or having human moderators, whether volunteers or whether they work for the company, going through and reviewing posts to look for TOS violative content. And that's distinguished from content oblivious trust and safety techniques, which, again, as the name suggests, do not require at-will access to content in order to work. And so that includes things like metadata, where metadata and content are not necessarily super stable and well-defined categories at the edges, but nevertheless, we can draw that distinction. User reporting, where the reason that the provider gets access to the content is not because it had the ability to see that on its own, but because a user reported offensive content to it, as well as other things like limits on how big a group can be, limits on account actions, and so forth. I ran this survey for 10 weeks starting about a year ago. I sent it around to a variety of different services using points of contact that I or my colleagues knew, with a focus on the kinds of entities where their business model necessitates having to think about and deal with the abusive and possibly criminal actions of their users, such as chat apps, user-generated content-driven platforms, cloud storage, and so forth. And ultimately, my analysis included the responses from 13 specific individuals. Of those, some of the entities that they were representing, some of those services are end-to-end encrypted messaging apps, but most of the participants are not. Many participants only responded to the survey under grant of anonymity, so I can't disclose who all participated in the survey and the sample that I'm analyzing, but the ones I can disclose I've listed here. It includes the 3 different messaging services under the Meta umbrella, as well as Wikidata, which is a project of Wikimedia, as well as 2 small link aggregating websites, Metafilter and Lobsters, as well as somebody who responded about the now defunct Yahoo Groups product. And this is quite a wide range of size of providers, not just business models, but how big they are. We have Lobsters, which has about 2,000 monthly active users, and then we have WhatsApp all the way up to over 2 billion monthly active users. And out of the anonymous participants, the median size is still well over 200 million monthly active users. So even though the sample includes only about 13 participants, nevertheless, they are responding on behalf of services that collectively service billions of people, possibly the majority of internet users in the world today. I asked in the survey about 12 different categories of abuse, which I've listed here. I won't read them all out. You can take a look. But you can see that this covers, I guess, most of the hits, hopefully, although if I had to do over again, I might make a few tweaks. For example, Camille Francois, who most recently worked at Graphica, has classified actors versus behavior versus content, and bots and inauthentic behavior are more about actors and behavior rather than content. So it's a little bit of an odd man out here. But nevertheless, my hope is that this captures most of the sort of major types of abuse that we talk about being encountered online, even if there might be a long tail that may be escaping there. To summarize my key findings before I move on to show you a few charts to more graphically illustrate it, I discovered that everybody that was in the sample, all 13 respondents, employs some combination of both content oblivious and content dependent trusted safety techniques. Of those, the most popular one, the most prevalent one, was user reporting. All 13 had some kind of abuse reporting. 12 of the 13 had an in-app reporting flow for reporting abusive content. And the last one accepted things like email reports for offensive content on the service. Less prevalent than user reports were metadata, and after that, automated content scanning, and after that, other techniques that I'll show you were less prevalent even than that. The most useful technique when I asked, what do you find the most useful means of detecting abuse on your service, was also user reports. The respondents said that they considered the user reporting technique to be the most useful means of detecting abuse for 9 of the 12 abuse categories I asked about. However, I also found that there was not a consistent representation of having those types of abuse be reportable using user reporting tools for all 12 categories, even though the respondents are saying that user reporting is the best way of detecting most of these types of abuse. The big outlier here was CSAI, or child sex abuse imagery, which I contrast and categorize separately from child sexual exploitation, which is things like grooming and enticement. There was a strong consensus that we didn't see for any other type of abuse, that automated content scanning, rather than one of the other techniques, was the best way of detecting CSAI. So those are the top line findings, and I'll just walk through some charts now. You can find most of these charts in my paper. Again, these are just the highlights. The paper has all the full details. Here in these charts, we can see that blue denotes the large providers, 10 big providers that participated in the survey, where they have millions or even billions of users, whereas red is for the 3 very small providers, such as Metafilter, that have monthly active user bases numbering in the thousands rather than the millions or the billions. So I started by finding out what techniques respondents use to fight abuse. This chart shows how many participants use any given technique out of the ones that I asked about. And here you can see that all 13 participants employ some type of user reports. We see a couple of instances where a content-dependent tool is just as popular as a content-oblivious one. We see that human review is just as popular as off-app reports. We see that automated content scanning is just as popular as metadata. And we can see here that the least popular of these options were limits on message sharing or forwarding or on group size. And that actually makes sense because these are functionalities that are most relevant to service type where you are mostly focusing on messaging, but they're not relevant to something like Wikidata. And the majority of the services, as I mentioned, are not messaging services in this sample. So it makes sense that we would see these messaging type functionalities coming in last. Going forward from here on out, the survey questions focused on 3 particular techniques: automated scanning, which is content dependent, and metadata and user reporting, which are content oblivious. I then asked, okay, well, if you said that you use metadata to detect abuse, which types of abuse do you use metadata to detect? And so here we can see that the number of providers for any given category tops out at 9 out of the 12 who said that they use metadata for both bots and for spam, followed by 8 for CSAI and for phishing or malware. You can see that there's no category where every single survey participant is using metadata. There's actually pretty low usage of metadata in certain categories, even where I found that a little bit surprising, such as IP infringement, where we have a robust detection regime in the United States, at least, premised upon the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that focuses on copyright infringing material. So I'm a little surprised by that finding. Next, let's look at how many services use user reporting, another content oblivious technique to detect each type of abuse. Here we see higher numbers overall than we saw with metadata, topping out at 11 for spam, followed by 9 for bots, harassment, and phishing or malware. But again, even though for most of the categories, you see more on average that are employing user reports than metadata, there's still no category where every single survey participant uses this technique. But even on the low end, the lower numbers, like for IP infringement, are still higher than we saw on average for metadata. These are interesting results, not just because of having a robust notice and takedown regime like we have for copyright, but also because so many of these topics are either flashpoints for policymakers worldwide, such as mis and disinformation or hate speech, or in addition to the longstanding legal regime in place for things like copyright infringement, we have laws on the books about stuff like CSAI. Now, one drawback of the survey is that I didn't ask participants, if you don't use metadata to detect a particular category of abuse, or you don't use user reports to detect a category of abuse, why not? And that's something maybe we can talk about during the discussion. The rationales underlying the no's in the last chart and this chart, as opposed to the yeses, we don't know why that is. And this last chart isn't in the paper. This is a table in the paper, but I think a visual graph is hopefully a little more compelling than the table. What I think is most interesting finding from the survey, I asked, what tool do service providers find most useful for detecting each type of abuse? And I gave them 3 options, which are automated scanning, which is in blue, metadata, which is in red, and user reporting shown in yellow. That first one is content dependent. The other 2 are content oblivious. And I've sorted this by the yellow bars for user reporting because, as I had summarized earlier, user reporting is the most prevalent and deemed the most useful across most categories of abuse, with the exception of CSAI. User reporting either meets or beats the other 2 approaches' usefulness for every type of abuse other than CSAI, where we see that automated scanning is just far and away the most popular answer, and the 2 content oblivious options don't even come close. If you look near the bottom, you can also see in 2 areas that there's a tie in terms of what's considered most useful, as between automated scanning and one or both of the content oblivious techniques I was asking about. And those 2 areas are CSE, where we see automated scanning tying with user reports, and spam, where there's a 3-way tie. So overall, automated systems, whether for metadata or for content, lose out to human judgment in terms of usefulness in the opinion of the providers, even at the massive scale at which some of these survey respondents are operating. But again, the survey did not ask why respondents don't find automated systems to be useful for the most part for most of these categories. For purposes of talking about end-to-end encrypted context, there are some interesting implications of these findings for talking about end-to-end encryption's impact on abuse detection. Recall that end-to-end encryption, because it hinders access to content, that means that it impedes automated scanning because automated scanning is content dependent, but it does not impede user reports or metadata because those are content oblivious. And recall that I found in the survey research that user reporting is considered to be more useful or as useful as automated scanning for every abuse type except for CSAI. And the takeaway from that is that end-to-end encryption can be predicted that it won't impact abuse detection efforts the same way. Instead, it's probably going to vary depending on what type of abuse we're talking about. We can expect end-to-end encryption to have the least impact on abuse detection where content oblivious tools are deemed to be much more useful than automated scanning. And in the data, some of the examples that we saw for those categories are harassment, hate speech, and self-harm. We can expect there to be some impact by end-to-end encryption on abuse detection where content oblivious tools are about as useful as automated scanning. And the example categories that we saw there where we saw those ties were child sexual exploitation, grooming enticement, that sort of thing, and spam. And we can expect there to be the greatest impact from end-to-end encryption on abuse detection where content oblivious techniques are considered to be much less useful than automated scanning. And the only example out of the 12 categories that I asked about there is CSAI. And so if end-to-end encryption's impact varies by abuse type, then that has a couple of implications. One is that we tend to hear regulators proposing that the solution to online abuse is to either break end-to-end encryption in order to preserve content analysis capabilities, or to compel automated scanning to proactively look for every type of abuse, or at least types of abuse that tend to be covered by proposals in various jurisdictions, which commonly have included not just child sex offenses, but also other types of pornographic or sexual content, hate speech, mis and disinformation, so on. But there's very little reason to break end-to-end encryption if it's not impeding the thing that is widely considered to be the most useful tool for detecting most types of abuse, which is user reports. And at the same time, there's very little reason to mandate a technique, specifically automated scanning, that is mostly considered not to be very useful for most categories of abuse. Basically, my suggestion for policymakers more broadly is that we have to have these debates around end-to-end encryption in a way that is more nuanced and doesn't just treat every type of abuse online as though it's exactly the same as CSAI. CSAI is very unique. What works best against that is not what works best against other abuse types, and vice versa, according to the providers that have been grappling with these various types of abuse. And so you cannot accurately forecast and extrapolate what impact end-to-end encryption will have on a provider's trust and safety efforts if you are extrapolating solely from the context of CSAI. And so to wrap up some takeaways here, online abuse just is not a uniform problem. There can't be a silver bullet that will work for everything. At the same time, as I think we're going to discuss, content oblivious tools are also not a perfect replacement for content analysis, and those aren't a silver bullet either. We should not be pretending otherwise. We can talk about, in our discussion, how content oblivious tools such as metadata analysis also have privacy ramifications, not necessarily identical to, but certainly worthy of consideration of, on par with the privacy implications of content analysis. And there just aren't any one-size-fits-all answers when we're talking about the growing and complicated and ever-evolving challenge of grappling with abuse online. We can't use CSAI as the sole context for building out a trust and safety program or for basing a law upon. We can't risk codifying something like an automated scanning mandate where that is already known to be ineffective across most types of abuse, or it may become so in the future, even if it works right now. And on the other hand, I think everybody in this audience is probably well familiar with the upside of having strong encryption in place. So breaking end-to-end encryption would have a lot of downside, but it wouldn't have very much upside because it doesn't break the detection capability that is mostly the most useful thing across most categories, namely user reports. And so in conclusion, instead of having broad mandates for what to do about online abuse, providers need to continue to have a suite of trust and safety tools available to them that they can apply to differing challenges. And they need to retain the legal flexibility to try out new strategies, to discard things that aren't working anymore, and to continue evolving, because abusive users are always evolving their strategies. And if you codify particular things into law, that risks taking away the ability for providers to continue to respond and keep up. Here's the link to the paper. Again, this is in the Journal of Online Trust and Safety. If you go to tsjournal.org, you can find it from there. Or if you contact me, I'll be happy to send it to you directly. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Riana. That was excellent. And that is really, really interesting data to see It's interesting to see how some providers view some techniques as better for different purposes, and a lot of that makes a lot of sense. Reacting to that, go into our first question on the Q&A portion, is something that struck me from both of your presentations is that it seems like user reporting and the use of metadata is the safest way forward on this. They're content oblivious. It just seems like it breaks the least amount of stuff. But then I also saw that on your data, Riana, that industry is looking at, thinks that for catching CSAI, scanning is better, or at least they seem to think that scanning is better. Are there things that platforms or that industry or academics can be doing to help improve user reporting or the use of metadata so that we can kind of bridge that gap and make it more useful for, or at least perceived as more useful, because it may already be pretty darn useful for catching CSAI?
I guess maybe I'll try to start out. Certainly one of the things that I found that aren't included in the charts I showed, I mentioned that there's not consistently strong user reporting tools for all the different categories of abuse among the providers that I surveyed. When I said, which categories do you allow users to report? Users can use like an all-purpose abuse reporting tool for whatever purpose they want to, but it seems like fairly low-hanging fruit to me, and this is one of the recommendations in the paper, just to make more granular user reporting functionalities. The paper discusses some previous findings and research that have been done by child safety organizations that have found that even where minors are feeling threatened online or find images of themselves being abused that they would like to extirpate from the internet, they have a hard time sometimes finding the right tools to do so or getting a response. And so there are plenty of UX and UI discussions to be had about what an effective user reporting tool might look like, especially when you have to think about child users versus adult users. But at least just increasing and making sure that this is a priority to make user reporting easier for this one context, I think is a gimme. And I want to sort of emphasize that, CSAI is one area where there are going to be a lot of people who are willing recipients and don't want to report this when they receive it. And so it may be that as to those users, user reporting is not going to be particularly useful because neither party has an incentive to report the fact that they're both engaging in a crime. But this is just a footnote in the article that there's been some research a very small sample survey that Facebook did where they were trying to figure out, okay, well, what are the motivations of people who send CSAI? It wasn't always malicious. Sometimes it was out of outrage, or it was because they thought something was funny or whatever. And so if there are people who are sending things that are not intended to be sort of knowingly colluding with the recipient to trade this material, there still is going to be, I think, utility for building out better user reporting functions. Because if there are people who are not intentionally trying to commit a crime by sending CSAI images, that suggests that there are people who are receiving this material as well who don't want to be receiving it. And so necessarily, while there's going to be some people that you're not going to catch because they want to send and they want to receive it to do crimes, still building out a reporting functionality seems worthwhile, not just for children who want to report unsafe interactions that they're having, but for adults who may receive this or otherwise encounter this kind of material and want to flag it for the provider.
A lot of that is also what I would have just said, that, user reporting functions is better for users broadly. It's also better for the content moderation problem broadly, not just for encryption. It, I think, puts a lot more emphasis on the education piece as well. So empowering users, giving them more information. These are all really positive things, and I think foster the kind of environment that we imagine our own children or friends thriving on, rather than sort of being made to feel watched over all the time. And the piece that was that Riana just mentioned, but that I think is really important to highlight, is just that when I heard from someone who now is on the side of child protection, sort of admit that, when first they heard the news about WhatsApp encrypting everything, felt actually relief and joy, because then they felt that their conversations with the victims they were trying to help would be more secure. But then over time have sort of bought into this idea that a platform like that could be backdoored to help victims of these kinds of abuse. I want to sort of go back and think of secure user reporting, secure conversations with users. Like, these are all net positives, actually, at the end of the day. And eroding that and making people feel unsafe will actually disincentivize, I think, reporting and discussion of these issues, so we need more, I think, awareness raising and more user empowerment and more approaches that treat the larger content moderation problem, because I think, and it's hard to know the data on this, even if we had the data, it would be hard because of the encryption piece, but there's still a significant amount of this content that's just in the clear. It's not actually that hidden. And so if we approach it, I think, from a general content moderation problem with end-to-end encrypted messaging as just one piece, I think we'll actually get a lot further.
For that, Mallory and Riana, there's a whole bunch of questions in the Q&A portion, so I'm going to get to a few of those. So thank you, everyone, for sending those in. One of them that has come in is a question about the regulatory environment around content moderation. And it's that with all of these content moderation regulations popping up or being discussed in parliaments around the world, would you say that regulators are open to granting exceptions with separate requirements for content oblivious providers, for instance, like end-to-end encrypted messaging or other forms of end-to-end encrypted communications? And then what's being done in the advocacy space right now to make regulators aware of the unique content moderation issues that these providers face?
In terms of like, if there's like a carve out, I'm not sure about other proposals. It's my understanding that, for example, when we were talking about the IT intermediary guidelines in India, that there's not a carve out that says, well, but if it's encrypted, then, I guess all bets are off. I will say I've spent a lot of time working on and analyzing and opposing the proposed Earn It Act bill in the United States, where after the point of this bill would be to try and incentivize the providers of online services to do more to look for and report CSAI on their services. And there was concern that by opening up providers to liability for the material on their services that they are not currently liable for under existing federal law, that this might incentivize providers to stop offering end-to-end encryption or to not deploy it in the first place for fear of being exposed to liability for the CSAI on their services. And in response to some of those concerns, there were efforts by lawmakers in a previous version of the bill, when it was previously introduced in 2020, to add some language to try and protect encryption and say this won't be a basis for liability. A version of that language is in the current version of the bill here in 2022, but it is not particularly strong. It basically just says that offering encryption can't be the standalone reason for imposing liability on a provider, but evidence of the use of encryption can be put in place, for example, to show why a provider was negligent or reckless in terms of allowing CSAI to be traded over its service. And when pressed about why the language wasn't stronger, one of the bill's sponsors said that they didn't want encryption to be a get out of jail free card for providers. And so at least in the US context, where we're grappling with this CSAI liability question in the Earn It bill, there is an opposition among the bill's sponsors to having any kind of like a strong, meaningful carve out for encryption, I guess for fear that encryption incentivizes providers to stick their heads in the ground and not do anything. And yet, nevertheless, it seems like disincentivizing strong cybersecurity is absolutely the wrong direction for us to be going. So I can only speak to the US context in regards to that particular bill, but I'm not seeing a lot of sophistication so far in terms of saying, we need to put encryption at the top of the policy priorities.
Yeah, and I can just speak quickly to the proposed EU legislation as I understand where it's at now, which is, again, that it would set up a body similar to NECMEC that would maintain a database. Again, there are lots of questions around oversight there. and so on. And it would sort of mandate then interoperability with, or it would mandate that platforms operate with that using an API that would just essentially, match against that database. So the problems with that are that we've actually seen then when implementers, platforms try to do that, there are concerns with the way that's implemented in a way that like, okay, maybe sure, even if the body that oversees the contents of this database is doing, they're doing their job, the functionality could be applied to things that are not part of that database. So, if you're scanning every single image that goes into a cloud, if you are scanning every single image that's going into a messaging app, like those are some real concerns because sure, okay, there's a database and that is, that's maintained. But again, we're talking about perceptual hashing. So it isn't exactly a one-to-one match. There's some degree of tolerance between like, does this image match these images? And then additionally, right, like now that you have it baked into the operating system, now that you have it baked into, the photo app or whatever it is, it could just easily be used for other things, particularly like intellectual property, terrorist content, any manner of things. So there's a lot of reasons to be worried about how the policies are written and how implementers then interpret that, make it actionable on their platforms. And of course, as we know, with all content moderation and freedom of expression issues, there's a tendency to overdo it, to worry because of platforms are worried about liability. And so that's a real concern as well.
So 2 questions that came in that are very similar and focus on similar issues is the idea of these content moderation techniques being used after the fact versus proactively to try and stop bad things from happening in the first place. And so one of the questions was about are there ways of using these content moderation techniques or other techniques that may not have been gone over yet to try and stop, for instance, bad interactions between adults and children, and potential grooming situations, or the sending of objectionable content? Would these proactive techniques, rather than reactive, run into the same issues as with end-to-end encryption, or are there ways kind of around that in terms of creating speed bumps or other things to just stop bad activity from happening?
This is a great question and something that I think will this is another area of future research for us that I find really particularly fascinating. So I think that, yes, if we're talking about like scanning images, not great. It breaks into encryption in my view. But there are things that would enhance user experience, especially when talking with an unknown number or a person that you've not verified as in your contacts list, that sort of thing, that are, I think, something we would all really enjoy. Again, because nobody enjoys receiving spam. Nobody enjoys receiving unsolicited nude images. Like, please blur those out for me until I click on them to see them. So that's an example of a speed bump where you just make the user take one extra step in order to receive that content. That also turns out to be really nice when you pay per data byte, right, on your phone. Like you don't download 5 images in their whole format before going through the extra step. There was also a proposal maybe to do things like, in the same way autocorrect helps you with your spelling when you're typing, it might be able to detect some natural language processing patterns that could prevent sexting or things like that. I mean, not terrible ideas. I think one really important piece of that, in order to not break the end-to-end encryption between those 2 endpoints, would just make sure that that natural language processing feature isn't learning on the job, isn't sending home your data as you're typing it, is kind of like, baked into the version of the messaging app that you download with the next update and then leaving it at that, right? That's and coming up with other things as well, like loading of third-party resources is something that, folks really into strong encryption hand-wring over. They don't want link unfurling because that is calling a resource in without consent. things like that. I think there are degrees of it. I think for any of these features, it's incredibly important to make sure that they can be opted out of. So you might offer it, but you shouldn't require it.
And the difficulty there, I guess, there's a tension between empowering users to have control over their experience and letting people opt out from, letting malicious users opt out from the very things that could potentially be used to detect them. I think we've seen a couple of questions in the chat, I think sort of go in the direction of trying to do proactive work. And I agree with Mallory, one of the things that I think are a big area for future research is just the efficacy or results of trying to do proactive user education efforts, whether that's at a very high level or very individualized per message or per conversation level, behavioral nudges. I think probably the leader in transparency about what works and what doesn't in this area has by and large been Twitter, which I think has a pretty good track record of sharing the results of the sorts of interventions that they try to do. I would like to see some more work from various platforms, both encrypted ones and unencrypted ones, about how they can use these after the fact interventions or responses with proactive changes to try and dissuade bad actions from happening in the first place, and what role that can come from on high versus what role it takes sort of on the ground community level norm setting and enforcement. Because I think a big entity that has a bunch of abuse to deal with, but does it in a very top-down way, like a Facebook, for example, is very different from the model that you get at like Wikipedia, where it is extremely community-driven and really kind of unique out there. So that's something that I would love to see future research about.
Riana, so looking at the time, I think we should go to just final points that you all want to make and then close out today's session. But thank you everyone for your comments. And I know there's so much more to say on this. And so please reach out to us via email, Twitter, etc., or end-to-end encrypted app if you want to use those. And we want to keep this conversation going. But first off to Riana for your final points on this.
Yeah, I guess I'll just close by acknowledging that these are very hard questions, especially in very sensitive areas like CSAI, and we don't necessarily have good or perfect answers. And then I would also just say, to sort of build on what I was just saying, I would love to see more information from providers to the extent that this can be disclosed in a way that is not giving a roadmap to bad users about how to evade your trust and safety mechanisms. There's a lot of discussion right now about how to mandate transparency and greater transparency from providers. That's definitely, I think, going to come to a head this year, but it's so hard to know just what's going on and what works and what doesn't. Is that I would love to see more data being published and more internal research being published by providers around all of these different questions about abuse prevention and mitigations and after the fact responses.
And if any providers are on the call, you now have your marching orders.
Just thanks very much. It obviously is a really, it's a hot button issue, and it always will be. I mean, I know it feels like for some of us, we've been talking about these proposals and backdoors in various forms for a long time. I don't obviously think that is going to change. If anything, what I've seen are the trends we're getting very specific. We're getting very detail and proposal oriented, and also a call to the platforms to know that we can work together as well on these things to help create guidelines for what would users really expect, what are the core features and expectations associated with strong end-to-end encrypted systems. And so I'm just glad to actually continue doing that, because from my view, it's solving other problems too, because end-to-end encrypted messaging, end-to-end encrypted storage is only one piece of some of these much larger problems. And if we can fix the much larger problems, that would be great. And I think that we can do that without violating end-to-end encryption in the largest, most accessible platforms, and not just pushing end-to-end encrypted messaging deeper into a space where only very, very motivated people, might still be using it, while the rest of us kind of have, like weak milquetoast kind of secure messaging. So it's good. I'm really happy to be speaking alongside such scholars as Riana. And thanks so much, Ryan and everybody, for inviting us to talk today. So thanks.
And thank you both for giving such excellent presentations and all your work on this. And last but not least, if you are from an organization or a company that's not yet a member of the Global Encryption Coalition, please check it out. It's free to join, and you'll get to join a really fantastic community that's helping promote and defend encryption around the world. And with that, thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your Friday afternoon.